We are here today with Randall Halle. He is a professor of German film and cultural studies at the University of Pittsburgh. And I thought we'd start today by asking a very simple but complicated question. What is German cinema, per se?
That's a very good question from my perspective. I mean, one of the things that's very interesting as a scholar of German cinema is that I've been observing significant transformations that are not always things that we recognize immediately on the screen. So one of the fundamental sort of motifs of production in Europe these days is to say that the best transnational film is a good national film. But what that means is that we look at a film that appears to be German, and if we stay until the credits roll, we start recognizing that it's followed by all sorts of funding mechanisms that are coming from a European level. And most people don't stay for those credits. Mm-hmm. And that's actually where it becomes interesting, is to figure out how this object, these images, are actually part of what we would describe then as a European apparatus of cultural production, right? Or cultural economy.
Cultural economy.
Yeah.
And so you would argue then that there's no such thing anymore as German cinema, right?
I think it's important, and that's a really interesting question, really for the European Union itself. Because one of the things I remember when I was young, long time ago, is being in Germany and seeing the first vote that was the sort of popular vote for the new parliament. And the profile of that was a picture of a man carrying a baguette, wearing a Basque cap and a British coat and something else, you know, and so this amalgamation is that there was this old thinking that the European Union would somehow evolve into this homogeneous mixture that people could select what they wanted and bits and pieces from various cultures, and there would be this freedom. But that's not the case. So there is a kind of weddedness to national culture, and there's a weddedness also at the same time to local culture. But the way that that's produced and the way it signifies has fundamentally transformed. So one of the big differences for me is that I would say the period what we describe as New German cinema, that's sort of from the 60s through into the 80s, was a period in which Germans were making films about Germany for other Germans. So they were telling German tales that the rest of the world could hear, and did. And those were great contributions to world cinema. I think now, film production tends to be, even at the smallest bases, the moving image is understood as being produced not just for a national audience, but immediately for a larger audience. And that there is nobody who would say, I'm only making this for here, or there's no one, you know, that's always a bad thing to do, right? But it is really the case that there is going to be an immediate orientation made possible by this European Union.
And do you have a sense now, so because German filmmakers understand that there's now a European audience and they're kind of making films for Europe at large, do you think that this has been effective in creating a stronger European identity overall? So
the Europa Cinemas Network is, again, a perfect example of how this is functioning, I think. And in the 80s, when I first started spending large amounts of time in Germany, it was impossible to see German film. It was impossible to see anything but Hollywood blockbusters. The EU has facilitated the reformation of local small cinemas through the Europa Cinemas Network, in which now there's a requirement of screening of European productions a certain percentage of the time, the majority of the time. And what that has meant is that, interestingly, you can now see not only German film, but you see alongside of that, you go to that particular cinema, and they're well attended. You go to that particular cinema and you have your choice of the French, the Spanish, and a kind of European ability to hear in some ways each other's stories. Mm-hmm. And that's all supported by this network of cinemas in which there's actually an encouragement to produce films for that network itself.
And I'm just curious, in the political sphere, we do see that this Europeanization has also been met with radical right parties that have been trying to recapture the national sphere. And I'm just curious if there's actually movements within cinema in Germany or maybe in other countries in Europe to reclaim that the cinematic sphere for itself as well.
And I think that what's interesting for me here is that the European Union is a project that's based on three forms of union. So the political, the economic, and the cultural union. And that question of cultural union is a sort of open terrain. And for me, all of these are areas of experimentation, but one of the things that we see with film production, with the production of the moving image, that it is a space of radical experimentation. So I can say that there was a historical period in which it was perceived as unpolitic to do things that were too much national stories. Right? But now it really is the case that a lot of directors are trying to figure out how to make stories that strongly speak about national traditions. But it becomes a problem at a European level to do that same thing. Right? And so if you do a story of Frederick the Great, or of Martin Luther, people who have had great pan-European effect, there are a lot of people who are going to say, that's not a good story for Europe. So I think that's why, in part, these sort of local national stories are well consumed within this network. And why a number of directors are really trying to figure out how to make those kinds of narratives that appeal to larger audiences.
And so just to be clear, my final question, so presumably, you have German cinema, but even in countries like Spain or France, those movies do really well, even only if they capture kind of a slice of local life in Germany, right? There's kind of a...
And it was the case, it used to be the case that if you were in Spain, you could watch Hollywood film and some Spanish film, but no French film. And the same thing in France. And so now, actually, part of this has resulted in the transformation. And it's not just in the cinema, it's also on grand televisual projects like Arte or 3ZAT, which is really a sort of German language, but Arte is this sort of pan-European broadcaster. And those produce audiences for stories that reach well beyond. And at the same time sort of respecting this plurality of Europe. And I think that's part of what's really interesting to me, is that we're not moving towards a United States of Europe. We're moving to some other configuration. And that's really where it gets very interesting, because it's unfortunate if we expect it to be United States of Europe. And so our film objects are good markers of how those experiments are going along and the way people are imagining new communities.
Well, I'm going to thank you very much for giving us a very diverse perspective on something that has pretty much been the terrain of political science. I think we can agree. And this has been a really terrific experience. Thank you.
Thank you.